Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Starr here with you guys. We are looking at Chapter 8, Key Issues 1 and 2 today, getting into a little bit of our political geography. And we have two big questions when we look at Key Issues 1 and 2, and that is, where are states distributed and why are states challenging to create? Question number one here as we get into things is, how are states defined? And when we talk about states here in the United States, we actually use it wrong. And so when we talk about states, we're actually talking about countries. States are not Minnesota, Wisconsin. Those are technically provinces or territories. When we look at countries as states, we get into more like the United States, Canada, Russia, and so on. And so if we look back, these sovereign political units is what the definition of a state actually is. In 1940, there was about 50 countries in the world, and today we have over 200 countries in the world, actually just around 200. Most states, when we talk about countries, are members of the United Nations, and we'll talk a little bit more about the United Nations as well. We also have a lot of microstates, and these are states that are really small. They have very small land areas, and so a good example of that would be like the Vatican City, although that's not recognized by the United Nations. We also have Monaco and Nauru, and there's some others as well. A lot of times those microstates tend to be little islands in the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, but obviously there's others as well that are not islands. When we come to the size of states, this can vary quite a bit. We just talked about the idea of the smallest states here, so those microstates. We look at the largest state in the world is Russia, and so it's about 6.6 million square miles, or about 11% of the world's land. So it's a very large nation or very large state. Now, it's not the world's most populous state, because again, we know that that's China, followed by India. But definitely the most for land area is what we're talking about here. And so other large states based on land area, we have Canada, the United States, China, Brazil, and Australia. Those kind of round out your top six. When we look at the smallest states, we already talked about the Vatican City. Again, that's not recognized by the United Nations. There's a picture of the Vatican City there and just how small it actually is. It's surrounded by the city of Rome, and then inside the Vatican City, it's about 0.2 square miles. And again, the smallest state in the world that's recognized by the United Nations is the state of Monaco, which is a little over a half of a square mile. There are, again, 24 of those different microstates all around the world, and like we said, a lot of the smallest nations in the world are islands. What are the problems defining states? So we get into a couple of good case studies here that come to major problems when we talk about what a state actually is. Number one is Korea. We know that Korea today is divided into North and South Korea, but technically there is just one country here. They were divided after World War II. They have both then established separate governments, one in the north and one in the south. The north government is communist. The south government is a free market democracy. And so that has led to more and more of a division between the two of them. There has been times throughout their history of being divided where they have become more unified during other times, obviously much more divided from one another. But today, it is technically still one nation, one country, one state. But obviously we have that division there. Another one here would be Western Sahara, or the Sahrawi Republic. And when we look at that, it is claimed by the state of Morocco, which is one of their neighbors. And Morocco claims that they annexed this area in 1976 when Spain left this territory to its own. And so the United Nations has actually failed to ever come to a resolution on this. And if you look at the picture there, in the 1980s, they built a sand wall to try to kind of isolate the rebel fighters from the portion that was claimed by Morocco. And again, this is just one of those other areas that leads to a problem in defining states. And we'll take a look at the map here in a minute with that too. Two of our other areas that we look at as problems with defining states, China and Taiwan. Taiwan believes that they are independent from China. China believes that Taiwan is part of China. And so basically after the 1940s Civil War, where the communists ended up winning in China, the Nationalist Party split and left and went to the island of Taiwan and established themselves there. In fact, the United States, even in the 70s, up to the 70s, I should say, was actually identifying Taiwan's government as the true government of China. So China, like I said, sees Taiwan as basically part of China, and they look at it as kind of a rebellion against them. Taiwan, again, is not recognized by the United Nations, but it's possible we may see some kind of conclusion to this in the future. All right, but again, another issue defining states. And then the last one we have down here is the Dioko Islands and the Senkaku Islands here. They are actually claimed by three different groups: China, Taiwan, and Japan. All claim the islands there, and this dispute goes really all the way back to 1895 when Japan claimed the islands, and they say that China and Taiwan claim that there has been never any legal claim that Japan has to those islands. So again, an issue with defining states here. So let's take a look at some of the pictures that go along with these four. Here's North and South Korea. Again, it was divided at the 38th parallel right there after World War II. This led to a Cold War engagement between the two sides. So you can see they both established capitals, Pyongyang in the north and Seoul in the south. And you've got that demilitarized zone. This is looking at the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone. So the side in the background there is the South Korean side, and the North Korean side is in the front right here. And so you can see much more rigid in the front versus in the south, and a little bit of American presence in the south as well. Here's China and Taiwan. Again, a little comic there that shows China kind of stamping out Taiwan. But you can see in the map there where Taiwan is located. Pretty large island there off the coast of China. Looking back here at North Korea again, you can see what the development pattern might be here. This is looking at the electric lights at night on the Korean Peninsula. So you can obviously see that the border there between north and south, the only real lights pollution you can see here in the north is basically Pyongyang. Here's looking at Western Sahara, and so you can see that the kind of light purple region is the Moroccan-controlled area, and then you've got kind of the rest of it is that orange-controlled area there, which is the Polisario area, and then in the north there you've got Morocco. So Morocco has claimed that kind of southern portion of that area there as part of their own, and that's led to more problems as well. And then here you've got the Senkaku and the Dioko Islands. Again, claimed by all three of them. Taiwan here, you can see. You've also got Chinese influence and then the Japanese influence on there. Okay, so it makes for a very big issue trying to deviate who controls which territory here and what a state actually is. So how did the concept of the state develop in general? And so if we go back, we have to kind of go back historically here and look at this. A sovereign state is kind of a new concept. Prior to having a state or a country as we know it, we have all kinds of different kind of levels of statehood here. So if we go back to the first states that ever were established, we all go all the way back to what they call the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East, which is basically Mesopotamia. And so if we look at city-states started to pop up there, these small cities that eventually became kind of sovereign political states of their own. They had a walled-in city. They had kind of a hinterland around the city that people lived in as well, and they were part of that city-state. Eventually, some city-states would become very powerful and gain empires, and that leads us then to kind of the early European states, where we see the Roman Empire starting around that, and then eventually we'll see the fall of some of these Greek city-states and Roman Empire, and we will see that will lead to what we call like the late Middle Ages, and these large territories then being controlled by kings and queens. And eventually we'll get to the time period where we see these unified states like England and France and Spain, where a king is in charge of basically the entire country or state as we know it today. So here's your Fertile Crescent region there on the left there. That's Mesopotamia between the Tigris Euphrates, stretching all the way to the Mediterranean and the Nile River there in Egypt. Lots of different small city-states. You can see Babylon, Baghdad, all of these cities kind of popped up at different times. You've got Jerusalem in there as well. Then if we look at the other side, that is the height of power of the Roman Empire. You can see anything that's that orange color they controlled at one time. And they all started back in Rome. Rome just was a small city-state, and through conquest, they gained all the territory around that as well. And this is what kind of one of the medieval city-states would look like. If you take a look, this is actually in France, and you can see that the city itself is actually walled in, and there's a hinterland and farmland around it that would have been part of that city-state. too. So when we look at modern states, we talk about what was the modern development of nation states like. And when we talk about nation states, this is a state whose territory corresponds specifically to a particular nation of people occupying that state. And so really good examples of nation states today would be like the country of Japan or the state of Japan. 90% of people that live in Japan are Japanese. And so that is one nation of people occupying that entire state. And so that's why it becomes a nation state. If we look at self-determination, this is nations that have the right to govern themselves without any interference. And so we talk about allowing new states to self-determine how they want to govern themselves and if they're going to be sovereign or not, essentially. And that's something that we've seen a lot more with colonies and things in the past. And we talk about Europe. Europe has been organized into nation states basically since World War I. Prior to that, we saw some nation states, but we started to see others develop after that as well. They tried to arrange the states so that they were organized around a specific nation or group of people at that time. And so historical developments have led to reorganizations after World War I, after World War II. And so Slovenia is another really good example of kind of a nation state. And that's what we're seeing on the picture of the map on the right there. That is Slovenia. And you can see that most people that live there are Slovenian, right? They are that specific ethnic or nation. And so that makes up another nation state example here. One thing that we can look at when we talk about nation states is the exact opposite. What about a nation of people that doesn't have a state? And the best example of what we call a stateless nation is the Kurdish people here in the Middle East. So you can see that the Kurdish people occupy all the kind of salmon or orangish colors throughout the Middle East. And you can see that they are in parts of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and even parts of Russia as well in here. All right. And so when we look at this leads to some issues of this group of people, this ethnic group of people, this nation of people not having a specific state. And unfortunately, they are minorities then in each of those countries that they are a part of. And so that has led to a lot of problems for them. So basically when after World War I, when the British started to design the borders in the Middle East, they kind of left out the Kurdish people and the Kurdish nation. So could we see the development of a Kurdish nation state in the future? And it's very possible. This is a video clip. I don't think we're going to watch it right now. We may watch it a little bit later in class. So what problems arise when you do have a nation state? We talk about this idea of ethnic diversity. And so there is no perfect nation state in the world. Again, the idea of territory being occupied by more than just one ethnicity. And we don't see a lot of times where just one specific ethnic group is occupying that entire space. Like we said, the good examples of nation states we see, I talked about Japan earlier, 98.5% of people are Japanese, and you can see the other percentages make up very small minorities of people that live there. And you can kind of see with this map here, the countries that are orange are less ethnically diverse, and so they are closer to being nation states, although they are not perfect nation states either way. We also get into the idea of what is a multinational state. And a multinational state is kind of twofold here. We look at it as being multi-ethnic because you have different ethnic groups living in that state. And we also talk about different nations of people living in one state. And so when we talk about this is basically two groups with feelings of self-determination. All right, they both feel they have self-determination, and they coexist peacefully as one state or in one distinct nationality with each other here. And so examples of this, really the best example is the United Kingdom. All right, the United Kingdom is everything on this map here. It is Northern Ireland, it is Scotland, it is England, and it is Wales. They all make up the United Kingdom. Now, those are all technically separate nations and technically separate countries, but they've come together with this multinational state idea because they believe they're stronger together than they are apart. All right. And so sometimes relationships can change and vary through time. In fact, Ireland at one point was part of the United Kingdom, and they eventually broke away and formed their own portion. In fact, you can see part of the part of Ireland remained with the United Kingdom. That's where we get Northern Ireland. They are much more Protestant than the rest of it. The rest of the island tends to be very Catholic. And so we'll talk more about that when we get to religion again as well. Or we did, I should say, talk about that when we talked about religion. In the north, you can see Scotland. Scotland could change in the future as well. With Brexit that happened, the idea that the United Kingdom was leaving, or Britain was leaving the European Union, Scotland was not happy with that. They actually wanted to stay, and they actually voted to stay in it. But because the rest of the vote carried them out, they were forced to leave with the rest of the United Kingdom. So we could see some changes in the future too. And so there are a bunch of other multinational states in the world too. This is just one of the best examples. Maybe the one of the most or maybe another one of the best examples here, I should say, of multinational states is when we look at the Soviet Union. And this is a historical example. But if you look at between 1924 and 1991, the Soviet Union was comprised of hundreds of different ethnicities of people, all organized into 15 national republics that were one under the same Soviet government, they called it, the USSR. And so this eventually led to, when the Soviet Union broke up, the USSR broke up, it eventually led to the creation of 15 new countries. Some of them are nation states, they developed after this, but most of them are multinational states. And so you look at some of the new nation states that were created at this time. We had the Baltic region, so Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which were, again, at one point part of the Soviet Union, but they broke away and created their own countries along the Baltic Sea. In some of the European ones, we look at Belarus and Moldova and Ukraine. Again, they broke away and created their own nation states there. And then even in Central Asia, the others here that we have, the stands, as we call them, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they all created their own nation states as well. So even though they have ethnic majorities here, there are problems that they face. And it's not just that they have a majority of one ethnicity or one nation running that country, but obviously there's going to be other groups there too. And that's some of the problems they may face. Economic issues, social issues, obviously those are all issues that all of these countries faced, especially as they were trying to create and establish their own new governments with the fall of the Soviet Union. So here's Russia today. So even though Russia did break away, and we saw the fall of the Soviet Union, those other countries broke off, Russia still is the largest multinational state in the world. And if you take a look at all these different colors, all those different groups of people living there, again, there's not a whole lot of population in kind of the Siberian region, but there are some people. But you can see that there are a lot of different ethnic groups, and it's led to a lot of challenges for Russia to try to stay united, even as they speak right now. Here's some of the ethnicities in Ukraine. So again, you can see where we have ethnic groups that are mostly Ukrainian speaking. Then you see there's areas that are mostly Russian speaking. And so that leads to some problems, and then mostly ethnic Russians. And so if you look at the Crimean Peninsula there, that actually has been annexed by Russia within the last couple of years. They kind of went in with tanks, and there was no actual like war that happened, but there was definitely the threat of war and kind of small skirmishes, and they took that Crimean Peninsula. So technically right now, Russia has annexed that orange territory, and they technically are in control of it, although it was sort of illegal at the time. There was no illegal annexation that happened. So we go back and look at why did all of this take place the way it has. All right, how did early states shape the organization of the rest of the world's land? And the big way we can look at that is it's colonies. All right, most European nations at some point in history controlled colonies around the world. And so the land was legally tied to a sovereign state somewhere else. Basically, there's all kinds of different levels of control, whether it's their sphere of influence, or they actually looked at it as a colony, or they just were a protectorate of that land. Either way, much of the world was colonized by Europe from 1400s through the 1900s. And their motives were basically threefold: God, gold, and glory. It came down to they wanted to spread the religion, specifically Christianity. They wanted to gain the wealth from those other countries, and they wanted the glory and the power and prestige for their country over those others. And so the countries in Europe that had the most power had the most colonies at that time. And so when we look at the first colonies in the Western Hemisphere, eventually do gain their independence right around the 17 to 1800s. And then later on, we see the African colonies and Asian colonies start to gain independence in the 1940s through 60s. So quite a bit later than those others. The largest colonial claims were made by the British. So the United Kingdom controlled much of the world. And there's actually a line in the book they talk about that. They said that the sun never set on the British Isles. And that's because literally across the world, it was always sunny, or the sun was always up somewhere that was controlled by the British Empire at that time. Few colonies remain today. The United Nations does identify 17 colonies throughout the world that still exist, and most of those are islands in the Caribbean or the Pacific. They are still kind of protected by different countries around the world. Here's your colonial powers in 1914. So you can see all those areas that were under control of others. Again, Britain being the one that really stands out here, the United Kingdom. They're the green color here. So you can see all throughout Africa, around the Arabian Peninsula, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, right, all the way down to Australia. So they control quite a bit of territory here in the 1914s and 1900s. And there's your colonies today. Most of the colonies, like we said, in the Caribbean or in the Pacific Ocean. And again, they tend to be small islands. You can see Western Sahara is on there as a disputed territory. But again, most of these tend to be these small islands throughout the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for today for Chapter 8, Key Issues 1 and 2. Continue on, guys. We will see you again soon for Chapter 8, Key Issues 3 and 4.